The Lord of the Rings the card game is a cooperative deck construction game where you and or your friends will embark on quests in Middle-earth. You'll each be supported by a 50-card deck of cards. In addition to the core set, you can buy various expansions for the game. Some large hero expansions, campaign expansions. You can also buy starter decks. There are 4 starter decks available for Lord of the Rings the card game. They are the Defenders of Gondor, the Dwarves of Durin, the Elves of Lorien, and the Riders of Rohan. In today's video, you'll know which of these starter decks, if any, you should buy. Like an overzealous kindergarten teacher, we're gonna break them down and give them grades. If you want to maximize your deck construction options for the game and get the most out of Lord of the Rings the card game, I would recommend getting all of them. I'll just say that right off the bat. You see, the game has been around since 2011, and these decks take some of the best cards from the history of the game. And some of these cards you won't be able to get any other way. But if you really want to get 1 or 2, come join us in Jackson Moorfield's kindergarten classroom. It's time to see what these decks brought to show and tell. We're going to go alphabetically here for the starter decks. So we're going to start with the Defenders of Gondor. You have 2 leadership heroes, Boromir and Prince Imrahil, 1 lore hero, Faramir, and 2 tactics heroes, Mablung and Baragond. The pre-constructed deck comes with Boromir, Prince Imrahil, and Mablung as your heroes, with Baragond and Faramir on the sideboard. We're going to take a look at the sphere breakdown, as well as the card type breakdown. Most of the Defenders of Gondor cards are leadership cards. The deck comes with so many leadership cards that you're almost forced to go with 2 leadership heroes. If you want to go with 1 leadership hero, you could pull it off, but your options are going to be much slimmer. All of these decks also come with Gandalf at the very least, so that's the 2 unique Gandalf allies. You see, what I have split in here is the unique cards into their own rows. Obviously, all the heroes are unique, but the allies and attachments, some attachments are unique and some are not. The more unique cards in your hand, the more dead space you'll have in your hand because you can't play more than 1 copy of a unique card. You still may want to have multiple copies of that card because they tend to be very good, but that's something to keep in mind if you want to know how the deck plays. When you build out a Defenders of Gondor deck on your own, you're likely going to stay with Boromir and Prince Imrahil, with the choice being who your 3rd hero is going to be. If you want to play an engagement-focused deck, that's a deck where you get bonuses when you engage enemies, you want to run with Mablung. Engagement bonuses are typically something you'd see in a Dunedain deck type, which you may see in the Lost Realm expansions. So Defenders of Gondor could complement those deck building options well in that regard. If you want to go with a heavy defense deck, you could go with Baragond. Baragond might be the strongest hero that comes in the Defenders of Gondor starter deck, so the fact that he's a sideboard character is interesting. You also have Faramir, who goes well with trap decks. 1, 2! Give a bit of a flavor of the different combinations and different deck types you have here. Boromir is focused around, I guess you could say, Gondor Swarm, or Gondorian Swarm. That is getting a lot of Gondor on the board and giving them boosts. So long as Boromir has 1 resource on him, all Gondor allies get +1 attacks. So the more Gondor allies you have, the better he is. If you attach visionary leadership to him, all Gondor characters also get +1 willpower, with the same limiter that you must have 1 resource on him. So Boromir is a natural for a card like Visionary Leadership because by having 1 resource on Boromir, you then meet the requirements for both Boromir and the attachment card. A lot of the Defenders of Gondor deck is built around this idea of hitting the Valor threshold. Many cards in this deck, like you see here, such as Angborn the Fearless, will get bonuses when your threat is 40 or higher. If you're not familiar with Lord of the Rings the card game, your threat goes up by 1 every turn of the game, and you lose when you hit 50 threat. Typically, you'll start the game around 30 threat or less. So if you're playing above 40 threat, 1, you're going to be at risk at losing the game. You don't have a lot of time to get things done. And 2, pretty much every enemy in the game is going to be able to engage you at will. So you're basically jumping into the fray by playing with the Valor deck. But all these cards make it more effective when you do so. It's very thematic. If you think about Gondor being right up against Mordor and being kind of forced into the battle whether they like it or not a lot of time to hold back and plan.
By the blood of our people are your lands kept safe.
That's the Gondorian deck archetype here. Cards like Pillars of the Kings will help give you a boost by going up to the Valor threshold automatically. There are a number of cards in this deck that are focused on the Valor bonus. You're almost certainly going to be putting out a Valor deck or a deck that gets some sort of a bonus at 40 threat if you're playing with Defenders of Gondor. If you play with Prince Imrahil, he comes naturally with Valiant Sacrifice. That's an event card that actually comes with the core set. You get extra copies of it in Defenders of Gondor. Whenever a character leaves play, Prince Imrahil readies, that's his ability, and you'll also draw 2 cards. So it's a nice combination there. Mablung, as the hero that gets a bonus when you engage enemies, can be made more effective by cards like Coney and a Trap. When you have a ranger and a warrior hero, which you will if you're playing with Defenders of Gondor, then an enemy that engages you has to wait a turn to attack, which is a great window for you to then take the enemy out before it does any damage. Faramir goes well with trap decks because Faramir gets an attack bonus for the more cards you have sitting in the staging area. Trap cards such as ranger spikes will keep enemies in the staging area, so you can get a compound boost there. Trap decks can be a little bit difficult to get going, especially compared to Valor decks or engagement decks. So keep that in mind with Faramir, that if you want to play with his deck on hard mode, putting Faramir in there is the way to do it. Baragon, not only a natural defender with 4 defense, but he also can have a free attachment of Gondorian Shield, which gives him +2 defense for free. You just need to draw the card. Defenders of Gondor is actually the strongest defense deck. If you're playing cooperatively, you're probably going to be the one doing most of the fighting. So that's where Defenders of Gondor comes through. What you're looking at here, Defenders of Gondor pulls most of its cards from the Heirs of Numenor. A few other notable takeaways on Defenders of Gondor. It has a card called Helm of Secrecy, which will let you switch out a hero at some point during the game. It's the only starter deck that gives 5 heroes, which may give you more options for Helm of Secrecy, but if you're going to use Helm of Secrecy and you want to be thematic, you got to use that card on Éowyn, because Éowyn, as many people know in Return of the King, was fighting without people knowing that it was Éowyn, which is kind of the idea behind that card. As mentioned, there are a ton of leadership cards, but there are no spirit cards at all, and in fact, there are no threat reduction cards, which is the main challenge of this deck. If you're going to be playing Valor, so your threat's already above 40, without any way to keep your threat down, you are running on the razor's edge here. So it's a risky deck to play in that regard. If you're playing Defenders of Gondor, you're going to be doing fighting and you're going to be powerful, but that's ultimately the story for the deck, is you have the risk of burning out. For the Dwarves of Durin, the rest of these decks only have 4 heroes. The pre-constructed deck heroes are Dine Ironfoot, Bifur, and Ori, each of which has a different specialty. Dine Ironfoot boosts all dwarves and is the core of the Dwarf Swarm archetype. Bifur is a resource smoothing hero. He doesn't generate more resources, but allows you to move resources between heroes. That's useful because you need to have a sphere match when you spend resources from a hero. So if you have 3 resources on a leadership hero, you cannot use that normally to buy a lore card. Bifur lets you smooth that out. He's making going with heroes of multiple spheres more effective. Ori and Bifur are both lore heroes. Ori gives you an extra card draw at the beginning of every round if you have at least 5 dwarves, which also feeds into Dwarf Swarm, and honestly is not that difficult of a threshold to get to. So Ori is effectively a +1 card draw hero. The sideboard hero is Nori, whose specialty is reducing your threat, and somewhat goes along with Dwarf Swarm, but we'll talk a little bit about Nori in a moment. There are no tactics cards in this deck, which is interesting for a number of reasons. First of all, the core set has 2 dwarves that are in the tactics sphere, Gimli and Thalin. You actually have another dwarf with Glowin. So you have a lot of dwarves here to pick from, so this is a total of 7 dwarf heroes if you have just the core set and the Dwarves of Durin set. But some of the strongest Dwarf Swarm allies from the original run of the game, such as Erebor Battlemaster, are not available here. If you thought Defenders of Gondor had an allies, take a look at how many allies we have for the Dwarves of Durin, especially the number of unique allies, as you do have a lot of named dwarves that will come out to play. You also have 3 copies of Gandalf as opposed to 2. Make of that what you will. The Dwarf Swarm archetype, as I mentioned, was the traditional dwarf archetype. The idea is you get as many dwarves out there as possible and use Dine Ironfoot to boost them. Some examples of the way that you could get that into play would be to have Dine Ironfoot, Ori, and Bifur as your heroes, and then use Bifur's resource smoothing to move lore resources over to Dine, which will allow you to, say, put Feely into play. Feely, whose ability is once you play Feely, you have to play Keely. So you can have Keely in your deck even if you don't have a spirit hero. And if you played Feely and got Keely for free, you're right there at 5 dwarves. If you're able to do that on the first or second round of the game, you're getting that second card draw from Ori right off the bat. The secondary archetype here within Dwarves of Durin is the mining archetype. See, that's where you discard cards and then use those discarded cards as a way of powering up your dwarves. As dwarves are miners, you're digging through the ground, so digging through your discard pile to find cards. So you're kind of manufacturing a strong deck as opposed to paying for cards the traditional way. It's an interesting archetype that will use cards such as the Sigil Miner, which allows you to build resources as discarding cards, King of the Mountain, which gives you both a discard and additional card draw return, and cards like Hidden Cache or Arid Miner, where as you discard the cards, they give you bonuses. Play Arid Miner, you get to put right into play when you discard it. So if you're discarding cards willy-nilly with Sigil Miner, you might discard some heirloom miners, and that's exactly what you want to do with them. If you're worried about running out of cards, the Dwarf Pipe is a necessary attachment because that allows you to bring cards back from your discard pile into your deck. Bringing Nori in from your sideboard is an interesting decision. One, being a spirit hero, you get sphere access for Residual Miner and some other mining cards. But two, Nori is a natural character to attach a magic ring to. Because Nori is able to reduce your threat whenever you play a dwarf character, it's easier than to palette a magic ring, which in exchange for increasing your threat, allows you to choose between adding resources, healing damage, or readying heroes. Magic ring can work just as well for Dwarf Swarm as for mining decks, because really it's just allowing you to get more cards out there. But if you're running a mining deck, you're less likely to have a ton of cards, and you're going to get a lot of benefit from being able to ready Nori. One other combo to mention is you have Dory, who's able to absorb damage, and periodically you can heal Dory with healing herbs. So it's a way to simplify healing a little bit. Unsurprisingly, most of the Dwarves of Durin come from the Khazad-dûm and the Hobbit expansions. I would say Dine Ironfoot and Ori or auto includes most of these decks, and you can honestly balance pretty well between Dwarf Swarm and mining decks. While the resource generation is stronger than other starter decks, it's not as strong as Defenders of Gondor, and as a result, it's not really as strong as the classic Dwarf Swarm archetype, which probably isn't a bad thing because Dwarf Swarm used to be very overpowered. This is a balanced version of the Dwarf Swarm deck, which is honestly probably a good thing in the long run. Moving now to the Elves of Lorien. Back to 4 heroes, you have Celeborn, Galadriel, Haldir of Lorien, and Elrond. And the main play style with the Elves of Lorien is getting bonuses as elves will enter or leave play.
What do you think?
I think you're trying to help.
This is shown very clearly with Celeborn, and that is how it's pronounced. It's Celeborn. It's not Celeborn. That's a Tolkien thing. On the round, Sylvan allies come into play, which is going to be almost all of your allies in this deck. Celeborn gives them a bonus willpower, bonus attack, and bonus defense. So the turn they appear, they're more powerful. Galadriel, similarly, is going to be powering up your allies. Allies can quest for free on the turn they enter play, as long as you have Galadriel. Elrond, who actually starts on your sideboard, also allows you to bring allies into play at no cost if you attach Vilya to them, which we'll take a look at on the next screen. If it seems strange at first that there are more tactics cards in this deck than there are spirit cards without a tactics hero, remember that Legolas is a Sylvan hero from the core set, so everyone is assumed to already have Legolas. As I mentioned, the way this deck plays is you have allies coming into play and out of play, so you have various effects that will allow you to either play allies at a low cost or have them just appear, such as in Hosts of the Galadrim, which provides a expensive but powerful effect where you bring all of your allies out of play and put them back in play. Basically refreshes the Celeborn and Galadriel bonuses, among others. But you get bonuses for discarding characters. So whenever you have a lot of allies, I could put them all on here, but trust me, there are just a lot of allies that will get discarded quickly. Orphan will allow you to bring allies from your discard pile back into your hand, which is a nice thing to have and is a balance you have to keep. You don't want to run out of allies here. Galadriel also comes with Nenya. Nenya is her ring of power and allows her to actually go questing with her willpower. Galadriel normally has an action where you exhaust her to choose a player to reduce threat by 1 and draw a card, but Nenya allows you to use her formidable 4 willpower and go questing with someone else. Frodo, for example. So that's a nice thematic touch there. Nenya also gives her a lore resource icon. If you bring Elrond in from the sideboard, you also get his ring of power, which is Vilya. Elrond typically is just a strong hero with 3 willpower, 3 defense, and the ability to pay for allies from any sphere. But Vilya allows him to instead just make allies show up and come into play. You don't have the Imladris Stargazer card, which was released around the same time Elrond was originally, which made Elrond overpowerful. So kind of like with the Dwarves of Durin deck, Elrond has been nerfed a little bit. Elrond's also a very expensive hero. It's impossible to use just heroes in this starter deck and Elrond and keep your starting threat under 30. In fact, you're at 33 if you go with Celeborn and Elrond in either Galadriel or Haldir of Lorien, which is a very formidable starting threat number. Well, that might not be the worst thing because this deck is actually very good at reducing threat. The Haldir portion of the deck is interesting. It allows you to actually get very strong ranged attacks in play. If you avoid engaging characters, so if your friend is playing Defenders of Gondor and is engaging other characters and is engaging enemies, you can get a bonus attack out of Haldir, a nice ranged attack, and you can actually attack enemies that are in the staging area. The Bow of the Galadrim allows a Sylvan hero, which could be Haldir or Legolas, to attack for 2 additional attack, and with a couple copies of Hands Upon the Bow, you can exhaust one of your characters with range to just attack enemies in the staging area. One other combo I want to mention is Henemarth Riversong, who's one of the strongest characters in the core set. especially if you play solo, as he allows you to look at the top card of the encounter deck. Combine him with one of your heroes having Wingfoot. Wingfoot lets you get a bonus if you can predict what the top card of the encounter deck is. So that's a natural combination between the two, and a very strong one at that, especially if you play solo. The Elves of Lorien are almost entirely from the voice of Isengard, and they're the most cycle-specific of any of the starter decks. The feel for the Elves of Lorien, with your allies coming in and out of play, is very stylistic. It's not the traditional way of playing where you just build up resources and buy the allies. You're dancing around, you're not directly engaging the enemy, you're picking enemies off from ranged or while they're in the staging area, and you're getting surprising bonuses as your character's moving in and out of play. So it's a more difficult deck to play, but arguably more fun, especially if you appreciate decks that are different or more complex. If you lean into the Haldir portion of the deck, it can have very strong attack, which can be very useful in a game where a lot of people are going to be focused on questing. You have strong questing as well. Where you're weaker here is you don't have a lot of strong defenders in this deck. It does have by far the best threat reduction of any of the decks, but because of the type of deck it is, it also has the worst resource generation. Lastly, we have the Riders of Rohan. Make no mistake, the Riders of Rohan have little interest in lore and leadership. They're all about tactics and spirit, so they really care, I guess. They're really spirited, and they can fight. Your tactics heroes are Éomer and Hirgon, who's interestingly a Gondor hero, and we'll talk about that in a moment. You also have the spirit Gondor hero Letheriel and Fastrid on your sideboard. So it's a little bit strange right off the bat that you have to use at least one Gondor hero if you're going just this starter deck. The pre-built deck actually uses both of the Gondor heroes here. But remember, there are 3 Rohan heroes in the core set, and 2 of which are very strong. You have Éowyn, who's maybe the strongest, Theodred, who's pretty strong, and Daenerys, who's fine. Éomer is the core of the Riders of Rohan deck. Éomer gets bonus attack when a character leaves play, which in a Rohan deck is going to be happening a decent amount of time. And he also has his own unique... Éomer also has his own... Éomer also has his personal mount, Firefoot. Éomer can get a huge attack number here. We're talking like, how does he take out a Mumok and return the king? Well, with 7 attack. That's how. Firefoot allows him also to use excess damage, which is going to happen with an attack of 7, another enemy. The main archetype in Rohan decks is discarding characters, which is a little bit different than the dwarf mining archetype. Riders of Rohan is a little bit of a cross halfway between the dwarf mining deck, where you're doing a lot of discarding, and the Elves of Lorien were getting bonuses when characters leave play. A lot of the Rohan cards will involve having characters show up for 1 round and then leaving, or having, say, mediocre stats like the Escort from Edoras with its 2 willpower. You can bring its willpower up to 4, and then it just kind of wanders off. Although you got other cards that will give bonuses. For example, when Aemon leaves play, you ready all your Rohan characters. When you have Horn of the Mark, when a character leaves play, you can draw a card. So it gives a similar-ish feel to the Elves of Lorien, but less temporary powers to keep track of. So it's a little bit less of an advanced player deck. One of the bigger themes with Rohan in the Lord of the Rings story is the alliance between Rohan and Gondor.
Where was Gondor when the Westfold fell?
In this starter deck, because both Hirgon and Letheriel are Gondor hero. Letheriel does get the Rohan trait if Éomer is in play, so basically you're not going to play with Letheriel without Éomer. And Hirgon there is actually holding the red arrow, which is its own card, which attaches to a Gondor hero. Guthlop is powered up if you have both Rohan and Gondor heroes. And Oath of Beorl, if you have Rohan and Gondor heroes, allows you to attack before the enemies attack you, which is a huge advantage in this game. If you want to use Fast Tread, it'll be because he's a strong defender, and he pushes enemies back into the staging area, where cards like Daenerys from the core set, or cards like Fourth Aerolingus allow you to actually take them out. Taking out enemies in the staging area being something thematically tied to having mounts and being very fast warriors, as the Rise of Rohan are. The Rise of Rohan deck uses a lot of cards from the core set in the Shadows of Mirkwood cycle. That's actually when the Rohan decks were the strongest. As disappointing as it is to have the Gondor heroes in there, it is possible to get a deck together that's just Rohan heroes. The last thing I'll say for Rise of Rohan, it does feel like there's some missing cards here, such as Theoden and Elfhelm, although those cards come into play in the Lord of the Rings saga, so they had to balance here. So the Rise of Rohan seemed to be a little bit cannibalized from aspects of the Lord of the Rings story. Now for the final grades. Defenders of Gondor. The Defenders of Gondor is a fun deck. It's very straightforward to use. You're going to want to put a lot of allies out there. And you got some of the stronger heroes, including Baragond, who, when you're just learning the game, it's really nice to have a hero that can defend for effectively 6 once he gets his trusty shield. It'll give you that valor bonus, which is a fun bonus to have. Without the help of your friends or some deck modifications, you're going to run over that 50 threat number pretty quickly. It's the Mad Max deck of the starter decks. I give Defenders of Gondor an A, partially because of how fun of a dynamic that is, and the fact that it can be easily played by newer players. The Dwarves of Durin is a slightly neutered version of the old Dwarf Swarm decks. Is simple enough, is also great for people newer to the game, just like the Defenders of Gondor decks. In fact, might be even better for newcomers. But the dwarf mining angle can be a little bit stressful. Discarding cards, in my opinion, isn't the most fun archetype, especially if you're at all worried about running out of cards. Still, it's a deck where you're always going to feel like you're able to contribute, as your guys will be questing, attacking, and defending. So it's a very flexible deck. I gave Dwarves of Durin a B. The Elves of Lorien. This is the advanced deck of the starter decks. There's no mix of archetypes here. It is just one. You get the bonuses when characters enter and exit play. Because it's an advanced deck, it's a bit of an interesting evaluation as a starter deck, but I would maybe save this one for when you've learned the game a little bit, but once you do, it can be a lot of fun. Easy to find yourself with not enough cards and not enough resources, but if you figure out how to work this deck, it may be the most powerful of the four, which is saying something. I give the Elves of Lorien a B. And the Riders of Rohan. Éomer is my favorite character from the Lord of the Rings trilogy because he's just a normal guy in Middle-earth where even Aragorn is kind of part superhuman. So I like Éomer. This is kind of the Éomer deck. But because it had to lean into the Rohan and Gondor alliance by itself, I mean, I guess having Helm of Secrecy and Defenders of Gondor is kind of an allusion over to the Rohan and Gondor alliance. It does seem like it's 3/4 of a Rohan deck with a Gondor deck. So it's a bit underwhelming as a starter. I see this one as more of a pack of cards to add to your deck building options, especially if you have some of the Saga expansions and we're trying to say play out the Lord of the Rings saga. I gave Riders of Rohan a C. And with that, class is dismissed. The short bus is pulling up to bring all you kids home. If you enjoyed this video, remember to subscribe to Jackson's Warfield Game Room and see where I transpose the apostrophe S for any future videos. I'm still kind of undecided what to do with that.